So if you're a regular member of our audience, you know one of the issues we've been focused on for years is judicial leniency, on exposing the network of incestuous corruption in South Carolina's judicial branch of government. Now, I feel like a broken record on this issue. We've been talking about it for so long. That's why it's always good to get folks in our studio who bring a different perspective on this issue. So today, we sat down with two of those individuals, York County Sheriff Kevin Tolson and South Carolina's 16th Circuit Solicitor Kevin Brackett. Both Sheriff Tolson and Solicitor Brackett have been fighting hard on this issue for years, pushing state lawmakers to make real changes to South Carolina's badly broken method of judicial selection and pushing them on issues of bond reform, docket reform, and sentencing reform. We sat down with both Sheriff Tolson and Solicitor Brackett to hear their thoughts on how to fix, in particular, South Carolina's badly broken Judicial Merit Selection Commission, which is the handful of lawyer legislators that screen and basically select the judges before they go to the legislature for election. Here is that conversation. All right, so grateful to have both of you guys in the studio today. The Kevins, we call y'all around here. You guys have been fighting this fight for a very long time. Before it was in vogue, before it was something that lawmakers were really paying attention to, you guys have been on the front lines, the tip of the spear on this push to fix South Carolina's broken judicial system. I wanted to back up, though, before we get into some of those reforms and talk about the why. What do you guys see every day that makes this such an important issue for you? And Sheriff, if we start with you on that one.
Well, the why is lack of accountability on two fronts. One is the lack of accountability that we're seeing for defendants. People come to South Carolina for a number of reasons, but schools, good roads, and good public safety. And when we don't hold people accountable, and I'm not talking about your first-time offenders, I'm talking about repeated offenders, and the crime doesn't matter. Well, the crime does matter. The more serious the crime, the more it ramps up why we need to hold people accountable. And I just see that we're holding people less and less accountable. If, as a child, if I knew that, my hand wasn't going to get popped if it went in the cookie jar, I was going to eat cookies all day long. And it just seems like criminals are eating cookies in that analogy. Secondly, judges are, and I'm sure we'll get into this in a little more detail, judges are not like Solicitor Brackett and myself. I am held directly accountable to the people. And we may even talk about proposed models for judicial reform. And I'm not advocating for popularly elected judges, because that is wrought with its own issues too. But judges are held accountable to really 10 people, and that's the Judicial Merit Selection Commission. And if you're not held more accountable to the people, then I just feel like you have too much discretion. Each voter in York County votes me yes or no every 4 years. And so I have to do the will of the people to the best of my ability, as long as that's right. So from my perspective, we're seeing just less accountability for those who are violating the law. When you violate the law, sometimes the state is the victim. Many times a person is the victim. And I'm an advocate for victims. Solicitor Brackett is an advocate for victims. The state is an advocate for victims. And we're doing victims disservices by not holding people accountable.
One of the fundamental principles of government in the United States, in South Carolina and every other state, is that we have three separate branches of government. You've got the executive branch led by the governor, the legislative branch, the House and the Senate. They pass the laws and appropriate money. And you have the judiciary, which interprets the laws. And each one of them has a role to play. And the system is set up so that each branch of the government is supposed to be the equal to the other two. And each one serves as a check and a balance on the others. It's almost like rock, paper, scissors. One of them can beat the other one. There's a way that, the system is supposed to stay in balance. And if one branch of government totally dominates another branch, well, it doesn't result in a good government for the people, because that branch of government is basically denied the independence that they should have to perform their proper function in government. And in South Carolina, we have a legislature which selects the judges, pays the judges, and can get rid of the judges. So I don't know how anybody could look at that and say, well, they're separate, they're independent, they stand on their own. Well, if you're hired, paid, and can be fired by somebody, you are not a peer. You are an employee. And I'm concerned about judicial independence. And that's what, to me, that's one of the things that drives, in addition to accountability. But to what the sheriff is saying, if a judge wants to send somebody to jail, but they get the clear message, don't send people to jail because we don't want the Department of Corrections to be filled. And we'll be watching. We keep an eye on you. What's that judge? Is that judge free to impose the sentence that they really want to impose? Well, they have to make a choice. Do I do what I might think is right, or do I have to worry about what somebody might read into that, or how they may respond later when I have to go back up for reappointment? And that should not be the case. I'm not saying that the legislature shouldn't have a hand in judicial selection at the outset. I think the task should be split between the governor and the legislature. But ultimately, I think the best model ends with the people deciding in periodic retention elections, not competitive elections where they have to raise money and so forth, but in periodic retention elections, which is the case in many states around the country, where the people get to decide, is this person serving our interests? Are they a good judge? Are they a fair judge? Do we want them to remain a judge? And if they say no, then it goes back to the legislature and the governor to pick the replacement. So I'm advocating because, for change, because I want to see a judiciary that is no longer constrained by fear of what the legislature might do for them. In addition to advocating for change in selection of in change in how we select judges, I also believe that we need to change or establish a funding formula that mandates a minimum baseline, a percentage of the annual budget that can't be tinkered with in the Constitution. So the legislature can't come back and say, well, now we're going to, cut the number of judges you have, or we're going to, we're coming back at you another way through the power of the purse, because that's another way that they can improperly influence their co-equal branch of government. Mandate that they fund the judiciary at a certain level so that we can have a truly independent judiciary that's free to make the right decision and the best decision according to the law without worrying about who they might be pissing off under the dome.
Well, I wanted to ask you both about that, because one of the things that this news outlet, we've been very critical of the judges, because they're the ones who are making these decisions that seem completely at odds with public safety, with victims' rights. In fact, just this past week, we did a story on a judge who received a case where a lawyer legislator was representing a client, a violent accused offender. A circuit court judge had just revoked this individual's bond. The individual then hires the lawyer legislator, who goes before another judge, and the bond is reinstated, and this violent criminal is turned back on the streets.
That sounds like a familiar story.
Well, and
is it the judge's fault? Is it the lawyer's?
You can't say for sure in a situation that we have. There are undoubtedly judges who are perfectly content issuing light sentences and putting people out on bond. There are no question people who believe in their heart that's the right thing to do. And if they do that, and in a situation where there were retention elections, if the people in their district agreed that's what we want from our judge, then they'd remain the judge forever.
And you would have no problem with that.
That's right. As long as you serve that jurisdiction and those people and those only, and those people decide this is the quality of justice that we want, that's a democracy. That's how a democracy functions. But we can't know that, because there are some judges who might not want to make these decisions, but feel they have to. They feel that sort of the marching orders have come down, and they don't want to upset the people who have the ability to remove them from office.
I'm perfectly fine giving you an example that happened locally.
Please.
I'll take a couple minutes. So we have a situation where an individual was violently murdered. A circuit court judge denied this individual's bond, and without going into any merits of the case, there was strong evidence. And I know a bond hearing is not the time to hear all the evidence, but you have to hear certain factors: flight risk, danger to community. And we started monitoring this individual's calls in jail. And it became quite clear that they hired a very competent lawyer whom represented him in the initial bond hearing. It became very clear during the course of these conversations that they wanted a particular lawyer legislator who serves on the JMSC because he had influence over judges. They wanted a particular judge. I don't know how that came about. I don't know what conversations took place. Doesn't really matter to me. But they wanted a particular judge who was going to be visited in York County. Fast forward to the bond hearing. It had already been made clear by the administrative judge, am I correct, at the time?
What had been made clear?
That he wasn't going to hear it.
Yes. At first, we thought the thing wasn't going to go because
I couldn't be there.
Victims couldn't be there.
Victim's daughter couldn't be there. And you know, we made that clear to the court that we would like to be present. And of course, under the Victims' Right Bill, a victim has the absolute right to be present at every hearing. The judge that was chosen by the family, or by however that happened, overruled that judge and said, no, I'm going to have the hearing. And Solicitor Brackett and I called it. I mean, we talked about this when that decision was made. We knew what was going to happen. And I was in Quantico, Virginia at the FBI Academy. I was able to WebEx in, and I told the judge that that this was not my belief, that this, through very clear evidence that I could produce, that there was a reason that this was the week for the bond hearing. He was the judge for the bond hearing, and this attorney was hired for the purpose of the bond hearing. I don't think that made the judge very happy, but it was the facts. No facts in this case had changed to allow or necessitate a rehearing. No facts had changed. This individual, the defendant, had very good access to the airline industry, and this was still a very, very violent crime. One of the victims could not be there, but yet the hearing was held, and this individual was granted bond.
The victim in that case, a former law enforcement officer, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, doesn't matter. From my perspective, it doesn't matter if he was a former law enforcement officer or not. A victim is a victim is a victim. And this was a very violent alleged crime. And that is clearly speaks to what Solicitor Brackett and I are talking about. And look, I'm not hating the players. There are some very good judges across this state. I'm hating the game, and I'm advocating for a change in the game, not necessarily a change in the players.
And whether there was something, you know, again, nobody can know what's in somebody's mind when they're making a discretionary decision to set a bond. Was that an influence or not? But the facts and circumstances from the conversations that they had created the appearance that something was wrong, that this, you know, lawyer legislator had more influence. Now, maybe they were just talking about it, and they didn't have any influence. We'll never know, because we don't know what's going on in people's minds. But it created the appearance, and that's part of the problem too, is the perception that that you can hire the right lawyer and go down there, and it'll make a difference in your case. And there isn't this aspect of the lawyer legislator influence on the system is not open to debate, and it's not subject to speculation, and that's the protection that they get from January through the end of July. If you don't understand the impact that that has as a prosecutor on my case, and the complexity and difficulty, the tactical advantage that that gives the defense to be able to delay a case for more than half the year, every single year, then I'll illustrate it with one quick example. Todd Rutherford, hired on a case involving a school official who was accused of having sexual relations with a student at their high school. That case, because it was Todd on the other side, we couldn't get him into court for 7 years.
So this victim had
7 years.
had matured and dealt with this without any resolution whatsoever for 7 years.
This case hanging over their head. I mean, it is undoubted that that provides a tactical advantage. And I understand the importance of having legislators, serve and represent their constituency. I'm not debating that. But for 7 years, and there was one flash, I guess it was last year, where it appeared that they might be trying to rein that in. And there was a public order that said, we're going to get to the bottom of this and we got to move these cases. And then
Next day it was rescinded. Yeah.
Privately in an email, not
Yeah.
publicly. It was like, here's the official position, public, and then forget what I just said.
Which goes back to that need for judicial independence.
Exactly. What was it that caused somebody to do that? Did they get a call and say, hey, that's not sitting well with the Brotherhood over here at the legislature. You need to do something about that. I don't know. But it's kind of odd. Not kind of odd, it is odd. I mean, why would somebody put out an order saying we're going to change the way we're doing this and then say, no, we're not. We're not going to do that. And it is a clear advantage over other attorneys. It's a competitive advantage. You sit down with a lawyer legislator and they can tell you, look, man, I can keep you out of court for 7 months out of the year without any questions asked. And then the rest of the year, all I have to do is come up with something that is related to being in the legislature. I have a meeting. I've got a conference that I'm attending with the National Legislative Association of whatever. And if it has the word legislature in it, which judge is going to say, I don't care, Senator, I don't care, Representative, you're going to be in court? They don't do it because why would they put themselves at odds?
And if that doesn't work, as you mentioned, they control their hiring, salary, and firing.
Well, that's the threat. That's the sword of Damocles that hangs over each judge, is the reality that is one day I'm going to be standing back down there with my little name tag on saying judicial candidate, and I'm going to have to, make sure these people are happy with me. And I don't want one of these guys walking up and going, you remember that time? Why didn't you accommodate me? That was an important meeting, and I had to cancel that and come to court. I'm not happy with you. If that's the way you're going to, that's what's going, how do you not think that? I mean, realistically, it's just like it's not all judges, it's not all legislators, because I'll be damned if Dick Harpootlian didn't find a way to get out of.
Just going to bring that up.
Yeah.
Kudos to Dick Harpootlian.
Yeah.
The Murdoch trial. Are you familiar?
A little bit. We may have covered that a little bit.
If I recall correctly, that trial coincided with the beginning of session.
It did.
And it was a lengthy trial.
6 weeks.
So it can happen.
It sure can. And I'll tell you what, if it's a bond hearing and it's the middle of session, in other words, if it's a hearing that is beneficial to their client, that they want, somehow they always find the time for that. But it's coming down for the guilty plea or the trial. That's when it's like tumbleweeds. Can't get a call back.
I wanted to throw some numbers at you guys because we talk a lot about this broken system and we talk a lot about some of these isolated instances. But I wanted to throw some numbers at you. Murder rate in South Carolina up 52.2% over the last decade. It's at its highest point since the early 1990s. There's been a 24.1% uptick in aggravated assaults over the course of the last 20 years. You look at these numbers, obviously, they impact what you guys do in the front lines. You're seeing these increases. To what extent does fixing this broken system, how does that potentially help us get at some of those huge upticks in violent crime?
Well, I think if you will go back and look at bond reform, which there's been some very positive movement on bond reform. I think it would be an interesting research project to see how many of these aggravated assaults and murders have occurred while the defendant is already out on another bond. That's, again, lack of accountability. Obviously, those numbers don't match our population increase, so no one can say, well, the population increased this much, crime would naturally increase somewhere in the same amount. And I just think it leads to accountability. The defendants, the criminals, have to understand that there are actions for your consequences, and they're seeing less and less and less of that. And violent crime and drugs, there's no doubt the nexus between the two. And I said this while I campaigned. We aggressively pursue and prosecute drug dealers in York County. We have lawyers come from other parts of the state. I was a solicitor's office employee for 15 years, so I do know the solicitor's office and the court system fairly well. And we have lawyers from other parts of the state that just jump up and down because of the initial offer. Well, if I was in X county, it would be probation or time served or whatever. And if you look at our proximity to Gaston County, a violent county, Mecklenburg County, a very violent county, and then you look at York County, our violent crime numbers, knock on wood, they're not, but they should be higher. And I think that part of that reason is the aggressive approach that we take to drug trafficking.
And I'll say this to dovetail off what he just said, but then I have a larger comment on your initial question. I know you have libertarian leanings, and I've read your position on drug legalization and that sort of thing. And honestly, if there was some place that we could take the addicts and segregate them away from society, I wouldn't care. It wouldn't bother me. I just don't want to be standing in line at Target in front of some guy who's on a 35-hour meth bender, who's there to get another lighter because his last one crapped out, and I'm buying my 12-year-old girl a new pair of swimmy goggles, and he's losing his mind because the line isn't moving fast enough. I don't want to live in that society. But you're free to do what you want. Just don't. Your right to swing your arm ends where my nose begins, and his right to do what he wants to do in a situation like that, where people are using hard drugs like that, it's not good. So we have to have a balance. Your original question. I went to the first Criminal Justice Reform Committee meeting back in 2009 in Charleston. I sat through the whole thing. I attended the majority of the meetings that the Criminal Justice Reform Committee had while they struggled to come up with the Omnibus Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2010. Their purpose, stated at the beginning, was to do something about the overcrowding in South Carolina's prisons. They wanted to reduce the number of prisoners. And their stated goal was to reduce the population significantly, take the savings from the Department of Corrections that would be realized from reducing the population, and folding that into programs through Triple P to help people get off drugs, do this, do that, turn their lives around, get a good a skill or whatever. It's laudable, in the abstract, but let's talk about how it turned out, because I watched them as they did it. Literally, they had some people from the aptly named Pew Foundation come down and take the entire population of the Department of Corrections and put it into a computer, and they would model changes that were proposed. They would spitball and say, how about if we drop burglary second from 15 down to 10 years? How many people would that let out of jail? Why, we'd reduce the bed population by 380 people. Oh, well, that's great. Let's do that. So they were basically trying to figure out ways to put fewer people in jail. They wanted to reduce the number of heads in beds.
They did.
And they did.
That population is declined dramatically.
24,000 and change in 2010 to 15,000 now. So we're down almost 10,000 people in 13 years. So, less than that during the pandemic when courts were closed and we weren't sending people in, they were just coming out. So, they accomplished that. But did the Department of Corrections budget reduce? No. Go look at it yourself. You can find the exact numbers online. Look at the budget in 10 versus now. And there's no shade on Brian Sterling, who does a great job. I like Brian. He's doing a hell of a job over there. And they need money. Corrections is expensive. But I think the public's willing to pay to be safe. I really do.
Well, we're paying one way or the other.
That's right. Whether you pay the tax man or you pay when they come home and find your door kicked in and your stuff stolen.
Well, I was going to ask, some of those folks that were let out, you've probably seen a few of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And our average daily population has increased over the last, since I've been sheriff in 2017. And so those folks they're just revolving.
Well, they
in and out, in and out, in and out.
They did, and the problem is now if you're not putting them in prison, you're putting them on probation, right? Now, are they behaving on probation, or are they reoffending? And that's where it's like we don't see what's happening with probation. That's kind of over here. Probation is one of the biggest problems in criminal justice today, because the message also went out to Triple P, stop revoking people. In
That's a failure.
2010, yeah, that's us failing. We need to keep working with these folks and turn them around. Some folks aren't going to turn around. It's all carrot and no stick. They have to show them every once in a while, you screw up, you're going to go to jail. But if that's not happening, then the message becomes, it's a paper tiger. The criminal justice system isn't anything to be afraid of. So these people who are getting put on probation now, in 2010, this is Triple P stats off of their webpage, 2010, 36% of the people put on probation in York County were revoked. They failed. They did not succeed at probation, and they had to go back to court. Now, 7%. So nobody's going to jail. They're going on probation, and no matter what they do, they're not getting revoked.
So is that a five-fold almost? More than a five-fold?
Absolutely.
Wow.
It's gone from more than 1 in 3.
And I'm guessing
Getting
people
revoked?
haven't been 5 times better behaved over the last
No,
decade.
let me tell you how bad this is. I sat in court and watched a probation violation. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago, before COVID. Probation brought a person in, and I only tuned in halfway through. I wasn't paying attention. I was there for something else, and I looked up halfway through like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then it ended, and I filled in the gaps afterwards, and I was like, that's incredible what just happened here. This woman was put on probation for stealing something. I don't know. She had $1,000 in restitution to pay. She was given a 4-year sentence, and it was suspended on 3 years of probation. And she had to pay restitution. And once she paid restitution to the victim, if she completed it, she would be off probation. They processed her into probation after she pled guilty, and out the door she went, and they never saw her again. That was that. She was gone. 4 years later, they issue a warrant for her and say, we need to pick her up. She failed to comply with probation. 4 years later, she comes back into court. They find her. They serve a warrant, arrest her, bring her into court. And they stand her up in front of the judge for the revocation. And the judge says to probation, what's your recommendation for this this defendant? What's your recommendation for the revocation? How much time? And the probation agent looked at his feet and squirmed and tightened, like, oh my God. We're recommending you just terminate the probation. In other words, no penalty, just end it. And the judge said, what? What's the basis for that? And the probation agent, again, looking at his feet, looking up, like, I don't know what to say, said, I think they believe that she would have served her time by now anyway, so they just feel like we should just go ahead and terminate it. So, and the courtroom is filled with people who are about to plead guilty, victims and defendants, who are about to plead guilty and get put on probation. And what was the message they received? You don't have to do a damn thing that this judge is about to tell you you have to do on probation. Because if you don't, we're not going to do anything to you anyway. You don't even have to show up. Just leave. I mean, that's where we're at. And this is why we have, these people who come and go and steal, shoplift, organized rings coming in, stealing, high value portable items, the prices of stuff going, try to go buy something with some razor blades at a CVS or a Walgreens now. It's all behind plastic. You got to get somebody to unlock it because there's so much of this going on and there's no perceived downside. They don't care. They already have a record. It's not like this is going to keep them out of, being a doctor. They're not, then it's, they've already committed to a life. And there's no reason for them to change because there's no downside. A lot of it's driven by drugs.
Let me ask you guys this question. There's 15 other solicitors. There's 45 other sheriffs. And obviously among those are some folks doing some really good work on this. David Pasco in the First Circuit. Leon Lott has been very outspoken about the dangers of catch and release in Richland County. Max Dorsey, another sheriff, I think is doing a good job raising the alarm. But you guys have been hyper vocal. You got, like I said, in January 2022, Sheriff, you were at the head of the Sheriff's Association. You wrote a letter that got you in a little bit of hot water with some lawmakers, but called some of them out for some of these issues. But I guess my question to you guys is, where are your colleagues on this issue? Where is the urgency from them that we're hearing from you?
I think they feel the same way. Different colleagues of mine I know have different problems. You know, I mean, some of the smaller counties and circuits, these guys are just overwhelmed. It's like, you know, they're at the Alamo and they're just trying to get their job done. You know, other people just aren't as out front and vocal. They don't want to get, you know, involved in stuff like this. They've got other things that they're trying to focus on. But I think most of my colleagues feel the same way. And they're like, well, let Brackett do it. He'll go out there and Pasco and Brackett, they'll carry the load for the solicitors.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And you know, let's face reality is, you know, we're dependent upon the legislature too. I mean, we want good laws that protect people. But I am not the sheriff of the South Carolina State Legislature. I'm the sheriff of York County, and my interest is in the victims of York County. And if we can raise enough awareness, because, you know, the average viewer of this presentation here probably did not know how we select judges in South Carolina and how just incestual that relationship is. And because who would? You trust that your government is for you, and you trust that the processes are fair. You know, a lot of things, we put a lot of trust in our elected officials, which we should. Takes me back to accountability. When it's not right, when things are not working well, then someone needs to bring the attention to it. And so Solicitor Brackett and I have worked together our whole careers. We've seen the changes in the criminal justice system. And I want to point out too, Will, in the wake of George Floyd, there was a national cry for police reform. I flew to Washington, D.C. and sat in a room with Tim Scott and Cory Booker and was involved in that conversation. And I appreciate both senators allowing, I was not the only one, there were sheriffs from across the country in the room. When they cried out for police reform bill in South Carolina, I don't know one sheriff that said, oh, no, stop, wait, this is a good thing. And it set 9 minimum standards. Many of those standards were already being met by a lot of police agencies in the state. But for those who are not, there's now a way for the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy. They're doing audits to make sure that you have standards, those minimum standards in place. And if you don't, they have the ability to revoke the certification of every police officer in that agency. And I welcome that. Most sheriffs, I haven't talked to one who didn't welcome it. So this talk about judicial reform, if this is part of an equation that's going to make the criminal justice system better, then why not talk about it?
Well, let's now shift a little bit of our conversation to the solution, to what's happening in the legislature to hopefully get us to a solution. Both of you guys have been at the State House. You've spoken with some of these lawmakers, and there are a few who, particularly this past year, have really stepped up and shown some leadership on this issue. As you guys look at the legislative climate right now, I guess, should we be optimistic about where this is headed, and who in the legislature right now is leading on this issue?
I know Joe White has been very vocal. He filed a bill, and Gilda Hunter was at the press conference. There's a number of other folks. There was a lady I met that day. I can't remember her name right now. I'm sorry.
Heather Bauer, perhaps.
Heather, that's right. Thank you. So, you know, there are a handful of folks in there that are working. I think as we educate people one-on-one, I think they understand, and I think they agree. The challenge, of course, is convincing both bodies, and the Senate is set up to make things fail if they want it to, and that probably needs to change as well. Especially on something as important as this, there needs to be a way to, you know, push things like this through. But I see some hope. At least, I mean, you want to talk about solutions. There's two things that we can consider. An immediate fix that will help make it better, not perfect, but better, would be to reform the JMSC. And we talked about that at a press conference. General Wilson convened at his office, and I appreciate that and his leadership on this as well. in that, that's something we can do right now with a legislative change. That doesn't require constitutional change. Changing how we select judges completely would require a constitutional change, which is a heavier lift. I get it. But changing the way the JMSC operates is a bare minimum, immediate, quick
So what change?
solution.
What's the change to that?
Remove all the legislators and don't let them replace themselves with their own legislative appointees.
So make the panel that screens judges comprised solely of non-legislators.
Non-legislators, predominantly picked by the governor.
So lawmakers would still elect the judges, but the panel that screens them.
That's right.
Would be non-legislators.
And I would go further. I don't know that this was proposed, but they have one term for 6 years because that's the length of time that a judge serves. So you get one shot at a judge. Then by the time that judge comes back up, you're not on there. So if there's a lawyer on there, when you're on there, you're not, you might have a little bit of a window, but for a lot of judges, they won't come up in front of you.
Yeah.
Shorten it to maybe even 4 years or
Yeah, you could
reduce it.
stagger it.
Yeah.
And I would submit, it not be all civilian, but it would make sense to have lawyers on the panel because they practice in front of judges and they see how the system works, and where a civilian may not know. But I would also say bring the executive branch into have a portion of the executive committee. 6 of the 10 JMSC members right now, 6 is a
Key
number, are lawyer legislators. So even if Satan himself wants to be a judge because they're in his hip pocket, they can overrule the other 4. So I would submit that there are 6 people who get to select judges if they want to in this state.
And they're all lawyer legislators.
And that's just wrong.
Yeah. And they practice in front of the people they hire. And don't get me started about magistrates. That's where so much.
We'll come back.
Yeah, that's a whole different thing. But I mean, that's just completely different. Imagine being a magistrate and having the senator who appoints you and can fire you every 4 years, step in front of you with a client for DUI, which is where most defense attorneys make their real money. That's their bread and butter is DUIs. So you get to practice in front of the judge you hired and can fire. I mean, the optics on that are horrible. How can somebody look at that and go, that's fair? That's a good thing. No, it's not. It's appalling.
When you mentioned optics, not that we should care where good ideas come from, whether party, race, or gender, but the 2 names you mentioned off the top there about lawmakers who are getting serious about this issue, Gilda Cobb Hunter, former minority leader in the South Carolina House, old black Democrat from Orangeburg, and then Joe White, MAGA Republican from Newberry County. Yeah. So you've got 2 complete
bipartisan
opposites politically, ideologically.
At least 2 people.
Yeah.
It's bipartisan.
Yeah. Does that give you some sense of hope that there could be eventually a bipartisan solution here?
It does. I really think, I mean, ultimately the long-term solution, and I've done some research on it. I spoke to a very, very smart guy who is a professor of law at Vanderbilt named Brian Fitzpatrick, who's written on this and studied the issue of state judicial selection extensively across the country, and a very thoughtful individual. I think the Tennessee model is a good one. The governor selects and the legislature confirms. I think and then after that, the people decide in a retention election. I think that's ultimately the best solution. Both other branches have a significant role to play. And then once it's over with, it is left to the people who are actually being served by these judges that they can, pass judgment on their performance every 4 or 6 years. And retention elections, from all I've heard and for what he's told me, and he's specifically studied it, they're pretty sleepy down ballot affairs. If you're doing a competent job as a judge, most of the time you don't have anything to worry about. It's when you start getting crazy and calling attention to yourself with behavior and rulings that are, concern the public and make them sit up and go, what's that guy up to? That's when you run into trouble. And that's the way it should be. I mean, everybody has to make a hard decision once in a while. I do. I've had to make challenging decisions that made people upset. Judges do as well. But you can survive that as long as most of the time people look and go, but he's a reasonable guy. Most of the time he does a good job. And he's got good reasons for why he said he did what he did. you can survive that. And so I think realistically that puts the people ultimately in charge of their ministers of justice. And it's a completely neutral in that it restores the independence to the judiciary and allows them to perform their proper function in our society here in South Carolina and government. And to me, that's the best way.
Guys, I got one last question for each of you. First of all, thank you for your time and for not only your time coming here and speaking to our audience today, but for the time that you've spent on this issue over the past few years, making a difference. But let me ask you this. You mentioned it earlier, Sheriff, about how a lot of folks, particularly folks coming to South Carolina, moving to South Carolina, who are used to being in states where judges are either elected or use the Missouri, Tennessee models, they don't know, as you mentioned, that how incestuous it is here.
Yeah.
For those watching this, what can they do? How can they get involved in this process to push forward these reforms that we're talking about? Then what can they do at the local level to try to make a difference on this issue? Any thoughts?
Your safety is in your hands. If you value your safety, and every single one of you is going to either be a victim of crime or have somebody you care about be a victim of crime. So it should be important to you. You need to stress to your legislator, your representative, and your senator that this is an important issue to you and you want to see it fixed. And you need to tell them you are watching it closely, and then you need to keep your word. You need to stay on top of it. Get involved, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican. Pasco, my good friend, Democrat solicitor, his sheriff, Sheriff Ravenel, Democrat sheriff from Orange.
President of the Sheriff's
President of the Sheriff's Association. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. This is a, do you want to be safe or not? Do you want an independent judiciary or not? You need to make this a priority for your legislator. You need to reach out to them because your life could depend on it.
And that's not selling fear. That's reality.
That's
Everything that we've said today, we can back up with facts. I think you had, and I'll just echo what the solicitor said. It's absolutely paramount that we look at this issue and try to work together to effectively deal with it. And something that strikes in my mind was a story that Solicitor Brackett told me. I think you attended a hearing during the talks or after the talks of the Omnibus Crime Bill Act of 2010. Is that correct?
Yes, they had continued meetings throughout the years to follow. The Pew Foundation would come back in and say, here's how many people are out of jail now, and here's what the population's down to, and these are the issues surrounding our incarceration rates and what you need to be concerned about.
Well, I'm not taking your job, Will.
Oh, this is
out of due respect.
We were talking about this
Yes.
earlier before we came on. There was a
Yes.
segment from those conversations where you said it felt like one of the legislative leaders was actually trying to identify which judges were doing their job by holding violent criminals accountable so they could then be taken off the
In this particular meeting, the Pew Foundation was reporting on incarceration rates and what was driving up the population. Who was going to jail now? And they said, it seems like the most significant driver of our inmate population now is probation violations. That's what's sending people to our prison now. And so they were talking about that. And at one point, Todd Rutherford jumped up and said, I got a question. And I encourage you to find that video clip. It was in about 2017 in the fall. There was a hearing of the criminal justice reform. It's probably 45 minutes into the hearing, but watch what he says because I think it's enlightening.
To Mr. Taylor's point, and maybe we should start looking at breaking it down per judge, because some judges just have a burr about probation revocations and believe that being on probation is your chance, as opposed to you took it because you pled pro se and it was the only thing they offered you, and so there you are, standing in front of a judge on a PWID marijuana getting revoked because you didn't report to your NA meeting, but you wouldn't have gone to jail if you'd have just said, I don't want probation at the beginning. So looking at the judges and seeing what judges are sentencing these nonviolent offenders to prison and revoking people's probations, because as Mr. Taylor points out, that is probably sometimes the best indicator of who's going and who's not is what judges on the bench.
What do you think?
You said earlier, it's the perception can be just as bad as the outcome.
That's right.
That when that perception erodes the public's faith in those institutions, which I think we can all agree, has been a real problem in this state. Folks no longer look at this system as something that they can trust to get justice for themselves, for their family members.
Larry Vaughn's family feels that way.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you both enough for not only your time here today, but also everything that you're doing to restore faith in that system. Thank you both very much for that.
Thank
And
you.
for,
Thanks
both
for
very much for being
helping to get the word out, because, I mean, all we can do is ring the bell and ride through the land like Paul Revere, but people have to grab their muskets and
Well, he was-
figuratively, and
he was a traitor.
Minutemen need to rise up and
Sadly,
Paul
unless
Revere, not
unless
Benedict
this system
Oh, gotcha.
unless the system gets fixed, sadly, it might come to that.
Yeah.
But ladies and gentlemen, the Kevins, Sheriff Kevin Tolson, Solicitor Kevin Brackett,
Thank
thank you both for being here, guys.
Thank you.
Okay.